Welcome to part three of Colonial America. This is period two from the AP College Board curriculum. We are going to analyze, finally, we're going to get to the middle colonies. The middle colonies, that would be New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. So again, staying true to the first two episodes, as APUSH students, we want to be able to see how this region developed, how they were similar to and different from the southern colonies, and of course the New England colonies. And so that being said, we'll just jump right into it. Middle colonies were known as the breadbasket colonies. It was known as bullet one. Known for its very fertile and expansive lands, less rocky than New England. The big thing about the New England colonies is that really it was the geography and the climate that made the New England colonies what it was economically. New England had a very diverse economic system in large part. I mean, if they had better land and they had better quality in terms of the climate, then there's no doubt New England would have gotten into cash crops. I think before I jump all feet into the middle colonies, I did neglect this in episode number 2. New England was obviously it's very Puritan in its founding. But ironically, the majority of the Puritans that immigrate to British North America actually go to the Bahamas. They actually go to the Caribbean. So that should tell you something, that the Puritans were, yes, they were all about religious freedom, but they were also about money. They were also about prospering. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that most Puritans immigrated to the Caribbean and not to the New England colonies. New England colonies, because of its rocky soil and its harsh climate, really lended to a variety of trades, timbering, fur trading, naval stores, small subsistence farming, dairy farms, and also some light trade work and manufacturing. So eventually, by the time we get into the 1750s, England it's no doubt the New England colonies become a major hub of merchant activity. Becomes a big commercial hub from the colonies. So getting to the middle colonies, of course, unlike New England, their land is not rocky, and the climate is actually bearable in order to sustain foodstuffs. It has industry, including lumber, shipbuilding, fur trading, with its accessible rivers. It also was, like New England, had increased trade and communication. Farming. Their farms are a lot smaller than the southern colonies, but much larger than New England. It was known for its ethnic diversity, its mixed population, and of course, this is the home of Ben Franklin, who came to the American colonies as a teenager. Interesting that Ben Franklin is the only founding father who was also a slave, because Ben Franklin came here as an indentured servant. He was originally an indentured servant and was able to rise to prominence despite those early beginnings. But he's going to become a figure of great colonial pride and intelligence, and he's going to become arguably the most well-known, well-respected American in England. He's very popular in Europe, very well-known. But in the middle colonies, British control was limited, and there was local trade and governance. So let's look at some key events that occur in the middle colonies. I think we'll talk about the nature of these colonies and what's going on But first, let's look at Leisure's Rebellion. This is a no-card term. This is a big part of an extension of an event that we learned in video number 2, which was the Dominion of New England and the Colonial revolt against Sir Edmund Andros. Remember, he was the henchman for King James II. So in 1689, there's a revolt against the rule of Sir Edmund Andros. As you well know, was carried out in Boston, but it was also carried out in New York as well. New York, of course, is one of the middle colonies. It was annexed to the Dominion of New England in 1689, and Jacob Leisler is a New Yorker who is going to lead a successful revolt against this effort. In 1691, when a new governor was appointed by William III, Leisler refused to give up power. So he had kind of grown to be not only an important revolutionary, but he didn't want to acquiesce and submit to a new royal governor. So he was arrested and executed for treason. But most importantly, talking about Leisure's Rebellion, is it did once again fuel this idea that English liberties had to be fought for if threatened by tyrannical government. And what we find, especially in Leisler's Rebellion, is you see in the various middle colonies, you're going to see in their colonial governments and their constitutions that they're very much concerned about the power of taxation. It says many was upset at the point was the right of to fight taxation. No representative assembly was elected. 1683 assembly wasn't elected. Okay, this is in New York, and they made a document, okay, called the Charter of Liberties and Privileges. This is kind of like the Charter of Liberties and Privileges, kind of the Constitution per se of New York. This charter gave all male property holders that were male and free in New York to vote in an election every 3 years. It gave rights such as trial by jury, security of property. And additionally, religious toleration was promised to Protestants. So you see this tradition in New York as, again, we want to think about in all 3 cases, the New England, Southern, middle colonies, the development of American identity, the development of American institutions, the development of American democracy. And you can see that throughout colonial history, that when government becomes tyrannical, that colonial Americans have a tradition of revolting. All right? They don't acquiesce to tyranny, that they actually fight it. And then after successful rebellions, what do you see remnants of? What lingers behind what generally follows? What generally follows is reforms, and you can see these reforms built into the Charter of Liberties and other colonial constitutions that are going to be drafted, during this period. So let's just look at this issue of colonial revolts before we get into Pennsylvania and who these colonies are in the middle colonies, what they're all about. Colonial revolts in general tend to follow a similar pattern. Now, whether you're looking at the revolt against, Sir Edmund Andros or Leisure's Rebellion or Bacon's Rebellion, all right, they tend to follow the same pattern. It's middle-class planters, merchants, or tradesmen rebelling against a group of well-entrenched elites who held a monopoly on power. Okay, so I want you to think back in this unit. I want you to look at all the prominent colonial revolts, and they all tend to follow this pattern. None of these rebellions were against British rule. Rather, their struggle was with local authorities whom they saw as preventing access to greater wealth or power within the British system. At the same time, the presence of British soldiers on colonial soil and the enforcement of the neglected navigation acts lead to increased tension between the colonists and eventual British forces. So when we look at these, and we're going to find that this doesn't change with the Revolution. In fact, we're going to have Shays' Rebellion in 1785, which really follow the same similar pattern. You know, that these colonial revolts tended to be malcontents living in the West, taking on power brokers, aristocrats living in the East. You know, it's the frontier versus the tidewater. You know, the haves versus the have-nots. You know, they tend to follow the same general type of pattern. So really the most middle of the middle colonies is Pennsylvania. And really this is where I want my AP kids, I want you guys to really focus on Pennsylvania. New York is a little bit different from the other middle colonies. In fact, because it doesn't take on the character of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. New York tends to be its own unique hybrid, I guess I call it. It's kind of a hybrid colony. It's very southern in the fact that New York is very aristocratic, largely owing to its Dutch roots, the fact that New York used to be a Dutch colony. I'll get to New York later, but really the emphasis on Philadelphia and, of course, her sister colonies, New Jersey and Delaware, is that these are Quakers. These are Quaker colonies. These are established by a religious group coming out of England. Pennsylvania, of course, is going to be founded in 1681, seeking a home for their kind of a refuge for the Quakers. Quakers, you got to understand, class, that they are kind of like the original rebels. They are nonconformists. They're the most anarchistic and democratic Protestant group of the time. Like I said, they're extremely rebellious because they oppose power structures that conform with British life, and they support ideas that were viewed as they would be viewed at the time as being very radical. First of all, they supported this idea that there should not be church and government. They were pacifists. They did believe in war. They did not believe in fighting. You know, when we talk about no church government, they felt like the king should not interfere. The king's government, parliament, should not interfere in your church. You know, though the Quakers, the church that they found are going to be very much, the church and state are going to be very much bound together. The very democratic. You know, when they held meetings, there was a sense of equality that existed. They lived according to what we would call the Golden Rule. In Albion Seed, remember Albion Seed is one of those required readings. You learn all about how the Quakers viewed liberty, how they viewed their rights, and it really made them quite distinctive amongst their English brethren. They did not pay their clergy. They didn't believe in what's called an established church. So you see that a lot in your textbook reading, established versus non-established church. An established church is usually financed, paid for with tax dollars. They didn't believe that tax dollars should go to support any church. The Anglican Church, by the way, is a established church. And so they opposed the Anglicans because of this. So a non-established church, obviously, is a church that is in no way connected to taxpayer dollars. Okay, tax dollars, not supported by tax money. So They were treated very poorly. I mean, they're kind of a dumped on group, um, and with the exception of Rhode Island and in Carolina, they initially attempted to settle in New England and found very found out very quickly that they weren't welcome. The idea of New England being for religious liberty is kind of a misnomer because they sought religious liberty, but only for themselves. The founder, of course, Pennsylvania was William Penn, whose family was granted a plot of land, was granted land from King Charles II in order to settle a debt. It becomes, as you can see in the chart here, it does. I mean, it's a good indicator that it's a very cosmopolitan, very populous of all the colonies, and of course, Philadelphia would become one of the most important colonial centers in the country. The city of brotherly love is the most Quaker of the cities. Anyway, so what Pennsylvania was built around was called the Holy Experiment. Holy Experiment. This is William Penn saw Pennsylvania as an opportunity to create a place of diversity, an experiment in religious toleration, equality, and diversity. And as a result, Pennsylvania became the most ethnically and culturally diverse colony. Penn viewed Pennsylvania and Philadelphia as a city of brotherly love, as a haven for religious refugees fleeing intolerant Europe. So by 1750, 7% of Pennsylvania was made up of Germans, 6% Irish, and then 5% made up of various groups like Swiss, French Huguenots, Scots Highlanders, Welsh, as well as other Scandinavian types. So if you were to go to Pennsylvania during the colonial period, you'd find a very tolerant society, religious tolerant society. You'd find a very important, like a strong degree of equality permeating throughout society. Very democratic, and of course, like I said, very economically stable through its farms, through the breadbasket. I said, Pennsylvania is the breadbasket. They grew the grains, the rye, the barley, the wheats. They fed the colonies. They're the breadbasket. So Pennsylvania also, in its Charter of Privileges, again, this is their constitution. This constitution was presented to William Penn in 1701. The goal of this charter was to restrict the proprietary government in deference to a legislative assembly, which would serve the Constitution. It served as the Constitution of Pennsylvania through the American government. So obviously they created a constitution that really preferred legislative government. They're very sensitive about tyranny, and thought that if tyranny were to rear its ugly head, it would be in the nature of an executive branch per se. So the Pennsylvania Charter of Liberties, look over on the right-hand side here. I'm going to read through it. It was seen as an important step towards the development of American government, which is a big theme in this unit. Hopefully you've seen this so far. The College Board and the AP folks really want us to understand what happens in period 2, what happens in the colonial period, that where you begin to see this development of American institutions, American democracy, American way of thinking. And here you see Pennsylvania plays a huge role in developing this distinctive American identity during the period. So the Charter of Privileges required capital punishment to be applied to a strictly limited scope of criminal offenses, only including murder and treason. It allowed for freedom of worship in the colony to be absolute. The Assembly could bring a request of impeachment of the governor. All right, so you got this power of impeachment. Again, we've got to protect the people from the potential of tyrannical government. Unconstitutional laws should be invalidated, although it did not specifically grant the courts the power to do so. And it included an amendment process where 6/7 of the legislature and the governor had to approve of any change. So you see the ability of you see these colonial governments. Really, you see these colonial governments all engaged in the same activity, and that is constitution writing. Just a few minutes ago, we saw New York. Now we've got Pennsylvania. In fact, the first constitution written in the American colonies is the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, one of those dissenter colonies of New England. It's one of your note card terms as well. So the first ever. So American colonists developed this tradition of drafting constitutions, basically putting pen to paper and spelling out what government can and cannot do. Where does government derive its powers? So, talking about Native Americans, the William Penn and the Quakers treated the Indians very, very well. Anytime the Pennsylvanians they didn't simply take land from the natives. They would always purchase, and the purchases would be fair. There were no major conflicts, no major wars, and the Representative Assembly of Pennsylvania, which I will tell you, the Representative Assembly of Pennsylvania had the reputation of being the most democratic form of government in the colonies, bar none. Remember, the House of Burgesses in Virginia was very aristocratic. It was very top heavy, whereas Pennsylvania was pretty much the opposite. We did have a revolt, and this is almost out of period 2, but I thought I'd throw it in here because it does deal with this, the problems of diversity. Diversity strengthens a country. Having a land of many diverse groups adds to the strength of a people, but it also can be destabilizing at times. In 1763, after the culmination of the French-Indian War, a group of Scots-Irish farmers, remember we talked about the nature of revolts here, East versus West, in Western Pennsylvania, attacked and massacred Indians after the French-Indian War and Pontiac's Rebellion. The fears of Indian raids on the frontier and the lack of Quaker protection led to a violent uprising of these farmers in Philadelphia. And you can see the picture of it, that these Scots-Irish descended on Pennsylvania, demanding that the Quaker government protect them from Indian raids in the western part of the colony. And so it led to a lot of tension, obviously, and the Scots-Irish, we're going to learn in the Revolution. When we get to the Revolution, Scots-Irish, they're a very important group in the founding of the country. And like I said, we'll kick that can down the road to the American Revolution. So the last part of this third installment is going to be the Great Awakening. All right, so I've embedded some links to some documents that really help us put our arms around the Great Awakening and what it is. I will argue that the Great Awakening is perhaps one of the most, if not the most important events in colonial history in terms of colonial unity and creating a unified body of American colonists. Yes, you have these 3 distinctive regions. Yes, you look at the Chesapeake, and you look at Pennsylvania, and you look at Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And these are yes, they're all English, but they're all very diverse in their thinking and their ideas on religion and politics and the rights of man. But you start to see the development of a unified body of colonial Americans. And it was built around a religious movement called the Great Awakening. Now, there's 2 Great Awakenings in American history, one in the colonial period and another in the 1820s, 1830s, during the antebellum period prior to the Civil War. I had a professor that called the Great Awakening the Woodstock of the 1730s. And so I've got obviously on the left-hand side of where there's Jonathan Edwards and his preaching and to the masses who travel far and wide to hear them. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, you got the actual Woodstock, the actual concert in upstate New York in the summer of 1969. So the Great Awakening, what was it? It was a religious revival led by a group of new ministers. These are these young ministers in their 20s and 30s, graduates from Yale, Andover, Harvard, who are seeking to bring people back to a proper relationship with God. Now, remember what preceded the Great Awakening is colonial Americans began to turn away from church. Remember the fallout from the Salem witchcraft trials, and the perceived corruption of the clergy, who we call the old lights. So the old lights versus the new lights. The old lights are kind of the old ministers. They're like your old hardened, they've got a lot of Calvinist. There's still a lot of Calvinism being preached with the old lights. These new lights are different. They're young, different generation. Many of these new lights, by the way, aren't European. They were actually born in America. They were born in America, and they wanted to rekindle the fires of faith and devotion to God's word during the 1730s and 1740s. And in doing so, they really helped to unite the American people, the colonial British. Great sense of unity is going to be created there. So what caused it? What caused, what inspired these revivals? One was the smallpox. The smallpox was a reality of colonial life that, once a year they would have outbreaks. And smallpox, if you were to contract smallpox, there was a time in which it killed 95% of the people that got it. It was a devastating epidemic. And really, by the 1700s, however, they had, in their rudimentary medical knowledge, they had experimented with some level of vaccination and herd immunity. We've heard that a lot, right? But it's still, despite their best efforts, it still ravaged the population, especially children. And so in the 1730s, smallpox was especially heinous, especially towards children. And so the old Puritan belief that God's invisible hand was at work, people really felt like that the reason why the smallpox was bad and why children were succumbing to it was because God was angry. And these ministers, remember, look at what their goal was. Their goal was to try to rekindle the fires of faith. They're trying to get colonial Americans back to church, back into relationship with God. And so they're going to use this smallpox. They're going to use this tragedy that people are experiencing in order to convince them that, yes, God is angry. God doesn't want the people to turn their back on them. And so also there's a huge concern over sharp decreases in church attendance. And of course, these new lights want to do battle. They want to challenge this old orthodoxy that's being pushed by the old light, these old established ministers. And I didn't include it here, but I think it's important to note as well, if there's a number 4, is they really want to create an American form of religion, right? They really want to attempt to divorce colonial Americans from the Anglican Church, from the King's Church, okay? And they want to create a more American experience, okay? A more American experience in church. And I'll explain what I mean by that later on. So the Great Awakening, who led the movement? Jonathan Edwards is one of the key guys. New England preacher, New Light minister, educated at Yale University. In fact, you go to Yale University today, they have the Jonathan Edwards Center there. They have all of his papers, all these old primary documents. are there at Yale University. He's known for creating many different sermons, writing sermons. He's kind of the ideologue behind. He's the idea guy. All right, so he's the idea guy, and his most famous sermon is "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," which again is kind of scolding people, reminding people that God is angry. That he uses this metaphor of a spider. That God has got, you're that spider, and he's got you by a thread. He's got you by the web, and he's dangling you over the flame of a candle, and that God could snuff you like that. And that he's angry, he's not happy, and that people need to repent and return to faith. But the big thing of the Great Awakening was the preachings. This is open air preachings, and the nature of it was hellfire, brimstone preaching, where the goal is to kind of scare people. The goal is to kind of scare you. The reason why your kids are dying from smallpox, the reason why your crops are failing, the reason why you stubbed your toe on the coffee table, the reason why is because God is angry, and He's forgiving. He's a forgiving Father. But he's also a holy Father that he'll punish you, and so that hellfire brimstone preaching was prominent, not only by Edwards but also other New Light ministers. Also focused on producing what was called an emotional conversion experience within the heart of the hearer. So the goal of his preaching is right at your heart. He wasn't trying to elicit a rational response, but rather an emotional one. And so his sermons and the sermons from these other ministers of the movement are really aimed at getting an emotional conversion experience where people, quote unquote, see the light. And at the end of the day, the end goal is that sinners must ask forgiveness for their sins. And that's what he's trying to do. And that's the goal of the New Light ministry. Another very prominent Great Awakening minister, George Whitefield. Now, he was a dynamic, charismatic preacher, orator of the Great Awakening. He drew massive crowds. So these were what we call open air preaching, because these guys are actually rebels. Like, they're not even allowed in churches. They're not allowed to preach in churches. They don't have their own brick and mortar churches. They've been banned because these new lights are considered to be rebels. Because remember, like I said before, they're preaching against established theology. They're preaching against the Anglican Church, the King's Church. So these guys are like rebels. They're out there trying to create in this country an American church, an American religion, American ways of thinking about faith. But he drew massive crowds. And yes, this picture is very accurate. He was actually cross-eyed. It's not funny, but he was actually cross-eyed. But they say that when he arrived in a town, now he was active in Great Britain as well as the United States, but they say that when he would walk into a new city or a new town, that there would be thousands of people who would line the streets just so they can touch his cloak, just so that they can hope to shake his hand. So these guys, kind of in the old 1969 Woodstock way, these guys are like rock stars. And they drew significant crowds, kind of like what you saw at Woodstock. And the fervor, the religious fervor, the emotional responses, the hellfire, brimstone approach to preaching made these events very, very intense. So overall, and again, I make the argument that the colonial, arguably one of the most important events of the colonial period is the Great Awakening, and I'll defend it by essentially giving six major reasons why the Great Awakening is significant. First of all, because it was a revolt within the Anglican Church, it did convince a significant portion of the American population to turn their back to the King's Church. And it cemented into the minds of American colonists that if they could revolt from the King's Church, then they can revolt against the King's government. So what the Great Awakening did is it led to what we call a spiritual break from the King and from England. So before you can have the American Revolution in the 1770s, in order to have, by the way, I'll tell you that before you could have any revolution, period, people have to break away. Before you could have that political break from your mother country, you first have to have a spiritual break, right? The spiritual break that binds you to your nation has got to be destroyed. And that's what the Great Awakening does. It also led to the rise of non-traditional denominations. These are what we call American churches. These are not European churches. These are not English churches. But what the ministers of the Great Awakening attempting to do was to bring what we call democracy. Look at number 4, religious democracy. And that's what England deprived people of. You see, in England, and basically I'd say in most nations of Europe, you were expected to belong to the King's Church. You were expected to be loyal to one church. You didn't have a choice. You didn't have a menu of options. Religious democracy means that we are not going to have one church. We're going to have many churches. And that these churches are in no way connected to the government. They're separate. And you get choice. If you take the old Quaker ideology and you mix it in, you're not expected to go to church. You don't have to go to church. It's not, it's not mandatory. You have, religious freedom actually means religious freedom. So religious democracy comes to America, which aided in giving people choice about what type of denomination, what type of church do they want to belong to. And so the Great Awakening also began the decline of established denominations, including the Anglican Church. Really began to break down. I had a professor that once said that really the reason why eventually the American Revolution does take place has a lot to do with the fact of the failure of the Anglican Church in America. The Anglican Church was brought to America to keep people loyal to the King. If you are a good Anglican, then you will remain loyal to the King and the King's government. And what Edwards and Whitefield do is they convince enough Americans that it's okay not to be England, even though that means that you are proverbially turning your back to the King's Church and to the King's government. So think about what it does to the loyalty. And of course, number 6, the Great Awakening produced a uniquely American strain of Protestant Christian theology, meaning that achieving salvation is the responsibility of the individual, and it may be attained through individual effort. And this is what Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers are going to point to, that whose responsibility is it for the attainment of salvation? Is it the minister? Is it this big power structure of a Anglican church? Or is it done through personal responsibility, through individual effort? And I love this quote. John Adams said, many years after the Revolution, John Adams was in retirement. He reflected back on the Revolution, and this is a very commonly quoted passage. He said, the Revolution, and this is John Adams explaining how did the American Revolution come to be. He said, the Revolution was effected before the war commenced. The Revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations. This radical change in the principles, opinions, and sentiments and affections of the people was the real American Revolution. So that's the last slide. This is the end of the colonial period 2 of the College Board curriculum. I will go ahead and say that I neglected to mention much about New Jersey and Delaware, and that is completely okay. When it comes to the middle colonies, we really want to focus on New York and Pennsylvania. Okay, so that's what I did today, focused on those two. So going to the AP exam, you want to make sure that when you go into the AP exam, that it's not mandatory for you to be able to describe each of the 13 colonies individually. Okay, so what I want you to be able to do on not only the AP exam, but also my exams, is rather than know all 13, I want you to know one colony from each region, and I want you to know them really, really well. Okay, so I recommend for the middle colonies, obviously Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, I want, so that would be something I expected. That is the most middle of all the middle colonies, Pennsylvania. Obviously for New England, Massachusetts. And if you know the story of Massachusetts, then you know the story of Rhode Island, for example. So it works itself out anyway. And when you look at the southern colonies, obviously the most southern of southern colonies would be Virginia. Virginia is also, I think, an important one to focus on. The Chesapeake colonies, not only because they were the first, but because they are going to produce our nation's the founding father class is going to come from Virginia. So really, that's really what I think you should focus on. So anyway, appreciate your attention and have a good one.